I'm Tom Switzer and I'm from the United States Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney, and it's great to welcome you all here for this special event. It's also good to see so many of you preferring to hear one of America's leading intellectuals on foreign policy rather than the Fox News presidential debate right now in Michigan. Otherwise known, in the words of the distinguished Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson, the bizarre, appalling, puerile, embarrassing, self-destructive reality television show on earth. I can assure you that our guest today is none of those things. Of course, Eugene Robinson has been one of the many guests that we at the US Studies Centre has hosted over the last 10 years. This year marks our 10th anniversary. And we were created in 2006 to really inform the Australian public all things American, higher education, politics, culture, innovation, foreign policy. And we do this year in, year out through community outreach, media outreach, undergraduate courses, and various other activities, including public policy research. Allow me to acknowledge several distinguished guests here today: the US Consul General Hugo Lawrence, the Brazil Consul General Carlos de Abreu, and Anne Mossop from the Sydney Opera House. I'd like to thank Anne and the Sydney Opera House for partnering the US Studies Centre on our 10th anniversary and for helping to bring out Anne-Marie to Australia. Anne-Marie Slaughter is President and CEO of the New America Foundation. During a distinguished academic career, she's taught at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. From 2002 to 2009, she was Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And during the first few years of the Obama administration, she served as the Director of Policy Planning in the State Department. It's a very prestigious position held by, among others, George Kennan, the intellectual architect of the Containment Doctrine, as well as Richard Haass, who's the current president of the Council on Foreign Relations, also another guest of the Centre over the years. Now, along with Richard, Anne-Marie has also been a regular panellist on CNN's GPS with Fareed Zakaria. Now, for those of you students who are interested in international relations, I can't think of a better program on American foreign policy and the world than Zakaria's GPS. It's on Sunday nights on CNN, our time, well worth watching. Ladies and gentlemen, it is great pleasure and a great honour to introduce Anne-Marie Slaughter. Okay, all the best. Thanks.
Thank you. When you were talking about the horrifying reality show that is the Republican debate, I thought this was a nice way of saying I might be a little more boring, but we will. So it's a pleasure to be back here. I have known the United States Studies Center from the beginning. I knew the first director, and I was here in 2008 when my family and I lived in Shanghai for a year. I came to Sydney and spoke here, so I'm delighted to be back. It's a particularly interesting time to talk about American foreign policy, and I'm going to give you an overview, and then we'll have a conversation. So let me start with what I think President Obama's legacy will be. And for those of us who are in Washington, the administration is in serious legacy mode. And what that means is you get regular calls from people in the White House figuring out how to hand off their pet projects to think tanks like mine to keep them going. And they're very much thinking about the legacy. And I would say, overall, it will be a strong and positive legacy, overall, with one major exception. But President Obama came in talking about engagement. Indeed, in his initial inaugural address, there was that famous line that said, "We will extend our hand if you will unclench your fist." And he was talking to Iran, he was talking to, you know, the rogue states of George W. Bush. He was saying, we will not cut you off, we will talk to you. And there was then a lot of commentary among pundits saying engagement is not a strategy. Engagement is a means, but to what end? What is the strategy? And so, in fact, the administration stopped talking about engagement as much. You didn't hear about it in 2012. But his greatest legacy will be that he opened relations with first Myanmar, then Cuba, and then Iran. Although with Iran, we have not restored diplomatic relations, but obviously the conclusion of the nuclear deal is enormously important. Now Iran sits at the table in the Syria negotiations, and I predict within a couple of years, we are on a path to reopening relations. That legacy is enormous, not just because of the significance of those countries, but because that changes regional politics. So before we changed our relations with Myanmar, Myanmar was a constant problem when we worked with ASEAN, right? So the ASEAN nations, that region is a very important region. I don't have to tell Australians that that's a very important region. And that was a constant thorn in our side. The very first thing Secretary Clinton did on her very first trip was to sign the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with ASEAN. And then we worked very hard to change relations with Myanmar. That means we're now in a position to work much more closely with that region. With Cuba, it is transformative. U.S.-Latin American relations, and we have the Consul General from Brazil here, he could tell me this. Most of my lifetime as a foreign policy professional, our relations have consisted of arguing over the U.S. embargo on Cuba. You know, and the disagreement of Brazil and many other Latin American states over what increasingly appeared to be a Cold War relic that we just couldn't get over, our hostility to Fidel Castro. So it's not just that now we have relations with Cuba, it is that this opens the door to far more creative and active hemispheric politics. And I have written that the 21st century will be a century of the Americas, not America, but the Americas, because if you look at, first of all, the way the U.S. population is changing, will be plurality Hispanic by 2050, and you look at the energy resources, the economic potential, the very interesting cultural and historical mix that is the entire Americas, there's a great deal to be done there. And opening the door to Cuba unlocks a lot of that potential. And then Iran. When I was in college, when I was the age of many of the students in this audience, the U.S. strategy toward the Middle East was called the Twin Pillar Strategy. And the twin pillars of our strategy were Saudi Arabia and Iran. Hard to imagine now. Those two countries have broken diplomatic relations, are completely at loggerheads. And of course, that strategy of ours was before the Iranian Revolution. But in so many ways, Iran is a more natural ally of the United States than Saudi Arabia is, in the sense that it's a country with a long and very distinguished history and culture that has been largely pro-Western. There are enormous numbers of Iranians who live in the United States. People refer to Tehrangeles in parts of LA. And again, Iran is still, the United States is still the great Satan. There's still any number of human rights violations. Iran supports terrorism across the Middle East and elsewhere. So I don't want to minimize the road we have to travel, but I still say that opening the door to relations again with Iran will be seen as an enormous legacy. So that's the first thing. I think on engagement, he has transformed the United States' ability to work with key regions in the world. The second thing, and people don't talk about this nearly as much, is the elevation of development. The work that I did in the State Department, what I was proudest to do by a long shot was to work with Secretary Clinton to elevate development policy to be equally important with diplomacy. And I have referred to development as realism with a longer time frame. In other words, what you're doing is looking at the root causes of so many of the conflicts and other problems in the world, and they come from people not having access to decent life, to opportunity, to education, to healthcare. Not surprisingly, many of those people either turn on each other, or turn on outside forces, or simply create countries that are ungovernable, and then all sorts of ills follow. And Secretary Clinton really believed, and yeah, she's completely right, that a strong, long-term foreign policy has to pay as much attention to the issues that face citizens on the ground as the interplay of state-to-state relations. And I'm going to come back to that at the end of my remarks. So working very hard on development issues and elevating development within the U.S. government, very important. Another one that I think people don't think about is this administration will be remembered for taking a stand on internet policy. In the winter of 2010, I listened to Secretary Clinton give the first speech ever on internet freedom. And she referred to the 4 freedoms of President Roosevelt during World War II, and she said the right to connect is every bit as important as the right of free expression, as the right to freedom from fear, freedom from want, that in a world in which more and more of our lives are lived on the internet, where it's the public square and the town hall and the cafe, then the right of people to have access to that world is a fundamental right. And in keeping with a focus on the internet and what the internet enables, the Obama administration worked to help launch, although Brazil was a key player here, the Open Government Partnership, in which governments sign up to the Open Government Partnership and pledge transparency and accountability and citizen participation. And much of that they then can achieve through the internet. So there too, no one thinks about that now, but I think when you're going to look back in 20 years, you will see that that was a watershed, that was a particularly far-sighted policy. So overall, I think it is a positive legacy. Let me now come to the exceptions. I do think it is true that under this administration, there is a perception that the United States has withdrawn from the world. I don't think that's fair. I mean, I just gave you 3 triumphs for diplomacy, 3 examples of engagement. How could you be known for engaging countries that we refused to engage before and be thought to have withdrawn from the world? Because one is with diplomacy and the other is with at least a willingness to threaten or use force. And President Obama came into office determined to get us out of war, and rightly so. In Iraq, the Iraq War was clearly had been dragging on and going badly and counterproductive in many ways. He had to end it. Indeed, President George W. Bush had started that process, and then wanting to end the war in Afghanistan. And he came in saying, we are spending resources in Iraq and Afghanistan that we need to be spending in Detroit and in St. Louis and in many other places. I agree with that, but he threw the baby out with the bathwater. He's been so determined not to use force other than drones and special forces, and the drones have created their own problems, that we are now seen in many places as a paper tiger. And in the Middle East in particular, that's very dangerous. If you are seen as being absolutely unwilling to back up your claims with force, you'll get pushed. So my last exception to his legacy is Syria will be the Rwanda of this administration. When finally journalists can go back in and see what has happened in Syria, we know that 250,000 people have been killed. We know many of them in the worst possible ways, through chemical weapons, through barrel bombs, through starvation. But we've only seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of the horrors that have been inflicted on that country. And I don't think Syria will ever be put back together again, at least not in my lifetime. We may cobble together a fragile peace, and I desperately hope we can. At this point, stopping the killing should be our overriding objective. But the fact remains, I believe, had we acted in 2012, when we first went to the United Nations, had we created a safe zone, had we made clear and used force after Assad used chemical weapons and said, you can fight a civil war, but you can't fight it this way. We will stop you from fighting it this way. We could have forced a diplomatic settlement much more quickly. We'll never know. But what we have now is a war that has shattered Syria, is shattering Iraq, threatens to destabilize Turkey, Iran, and northern Iraq in terms of the Kurdish aspirations. It has spilled over into various other parts of the Middle East, destabilizing Jordan and Lebanon. Yemen is back in conflict, and of course we have ISIL in the middle of it, and we're unable to act even unite against ISIL because of disagreements over the course of the war in Syria. This, to me, is going to be a tremendous black spot on what otherwise is overall a positive legacy. So that is my take on President Obama's legacy, and I remain proud to have served in the first part of his administration, and I think, with the exceptions that I noted, the people who've stayed with him have much to be proud of. Let me just say a few things about what the other candidates might look like in terms of their foreign policy. And then I'm going to end with a sort of broader framework and invite you to just think about these issues a little differently. I'll start on the Republican side. So if Marco Rubio were the president, I'm going to go in ascending order of likelihood. If Marco Rubio were the president, I think we would essentially see a foreign policy that looks like George W. Bush's. He will be far more willing to assert forceful leadership in the world, but in a way I would not approve of, in a way that flouts international institutions, and in a way that, particularly given his roots as part of the Cuban diaspora, is sort of sees anti-communism and dictatorships in a very simplistic and quite dangerous way. But it would, I think, look like George W. Bush. If Ted Cruz were the president, interesting, and we haven't seen the like of it, he combines more of an isolationism with an absolute determination to do anything that would support Israel. And if you watch him, and I've watched him for a long time, this is part of his evangelical roots. There's a strong group there of evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews who have a particular view of the world. And when I say support Israel, it's a particular view in Israel, a very hardline view in Israel. And when you listen to Cruz, he's willing to do anything that would support Israel, including intervening in the Middle East there. But more broadly, he doesn't see why we're getting involved in places where we don't have a vital interest. So that's not a combination we've seen. I would worry in many ways. I think we have no idea what Donald Trump's foreign policy would be. None at all. Because he has no political or ideological center, right? He is very good at appealing to the dispossessed, and he approaches politics the way he approached television. It's about ratings, and you play to the crowd, and you get the ratings, and that's what, then you know, if it doesn't work, you try something else. So I have absolutely no idea what he would do. He says he's opposed to trade agreements. He says he'd build a wall. I have to tell you, the best line I've heard about Donald Trump is from a Canadian friend who's in the government of Justin Trudeau, who says that if Trump were elected, Canada will build a wall. So again, what he says and what he'll do, we have no idea. I will tell you, I do not want to find out. So let's look on the Democratic side. Secretary Clinton, who I do believe will be the Democratic nominee, will follow Obama in many ways. I mean, she was the architect of a lot of this as well in terms of engagement. As I said, she reached out to ASEAN. Her first trip was to China. She was part of the rebalancing toward Asia. She was very strong on, as I said, the development pieces. She had supported the intervention in Libya, which I think we're going to talk about. She will, and she is very concerned to stop violence from breaking out. I watched her go through the Honduras coup, where there was a coup in Honduras, and we wanted to get the elected government back into power, but she was very careful to push in a way that avoided actual conflict. In other words, she understands that once war breaks out or violence breaks out, it is very hard to stop. And so where you can avoid violence, she will be very strong to avoid it. But where it is already broken out, the biggest difference between her and President Obama is she does have a more traditional view of the United States needing to lead, and that if the United States doesn't lead, very bad things happen. And so her view is, I'd rather be caught trying. That's what she says in her memoir, and I've heard her say that. And so on Syria, she would have acted sooner. Right? She would have said, this is dangerous and these are terrible choices, and she wouldn't put troops on the ground. The United States is not going to put troops on the ground in the Middle East for a very long time. But she would have acted. She would have tried either safe zones or arming the opposition when there was an opposition to arm. Her modus operandi is more likely action than inaction. And she really does, she's shaped from a different era than President Obama, and it is still a world in which you act with other countries and you act in international institutions, but it is your responsibility with your allies and partners to tackle problems that are very difficult and nobody wants to tackle, but if you don't tackle them, very bad things happen. All right, let me just conclude by saying that as I look at the world, and it is a bad time to look at the world. Secretary Clinton also used to say that people told her to focus on just a couple of things when she was Secretary of State, and she would say, you explain to me what I'm not supposed to focus on. Shall I ignore Ebola? Shall I ignore the economic crisis? Should I forget about Russia? Should I not pay attention to Iran? I mean, we now have traditional crises and new crises, cybersecurity, terrorist networks, criminal networks of different kinds. So it's a very complicated time. But we still only have one set of tools. We still have the tools that we developed for the Cold War, for a world of superpowers or a world of great powers. And I would argue now we're back to a world of great powers rather than unipolarity or certainly not two superpowers. But those tools, they're the use of force and diplomacy. And when we use diplomacy, it's deterrence, or it is a kind of a game of tit for tat to force cooperation. Or it is, threatening force, a game of chicken, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you basically kind of drive straight at the other nation and hope somebody gets off the road. Those are the tools we've had, certainly since 1945 and really for centuries. They are what I call chessboard tools, where international relations looks like chess. Think about Henry Kissinger, think about 10 great powers. It's a complicated game of chess, but it's basically, one big state's national interest versus another. What are you going to do? What are they going to do? How are they going to react to what you do? The threats we're looking at today are what I call web world threats. They are networked threats. They are the networks of terrorists and of arms traffickers, drug traffickers, people traffickers, money launderers. They are health threats, epidemics, climate. These are threats that are caused not by states acting, but by people acting and people networking with others. And we don't have a set of tools to address those threats. We don't have a sort of, here's how you build a counter network. Here's how you build an institution that will connect people to be able to counter those people who are posing threats. And so what I see looking forward, and something the Obama administration did not address, in part because it spent its time putting out fires, is developing those tools that will link not only our nations, but people and institutions and corporations and universities and civil society across nations in ways that can actually counter a new set of threats in the web world while we're still dealing with traditional threats from the chessboard world. So with that, I will leave you with an Obama legacy, some predictions on candidates, and an overview for how we see the world, and let's have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. And now's as good a time as any to say that Anne-Marie was the first, and I believe only woman to head policy planning at the State Department, which is really saying something. And that brings me, before we talk about the lecture, no doubt many of you are familiar with Anne-Marie's best-selling book, Unfinished Business, Women, Men, Work and the Family. That's based on her groundbreaking essay in 2012 in the Atlantic Monthly, Why Women Can't Have It All. Now
Still can't have it all.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Still can't have it all. And that will be available for purchase at the back there. And Anne-Marie Slaughter is very happy to sign copies, and that's after the lecture. Anne-Marie, you started with President Obama coming to power 2009. He set out after the overextension of the Bush years to redefine the American role in the world in a way that reflected limited resources, changing circumstances post 9/11. But you also concede some of the arguments that many so-called liberal hawks, the Washington Post, for example, neocons like the Wall Street Journal, they will argue that the Obama administration's legacy, a policy of leading from behind, has created these strategic vacuums in the South China Sea, in the western part of Russia, Ukraine, and of course Iran now in Iraq. Is there a lot of truth to that argument?
I think yes in the Middle East, but not in the other places. And I should say, I'm just glad you didn't include me in that category. I generally am included in the liberal hawk category, and my name is a disaster when it comes to it. I can't tell you how often on Twitter somebody makes some crack, and I think, get over it. So I think it is true. That's part of what I'm saying. I do think when Obama backed down after drawing a red line on chemical weapons, he did signal that he wasn't going to use force under any circumstance in Syria. I think that may have helped embolden Putin in Ukraine, because Putin had other reasons to do what he was doing in Ukraine. So but I definitely think it has made matters in the Middle East worse. You're now, countries like Saudi Arabia are now openly saying, well, you guys aren't going to play. We'll go talk to the Russians, or we'll talk to others. And so yes, there's a vacuum there that other countries fill, and I don't think that's better. I don't think that's true at all in China. I mean, the point was that George W. Bush spent 8 years focused on the Middle East, and the Obama administration came in and said, you know, you have left a vacuum in Asia, right? You haven't shown up. Famously, the president canceled trips, Condi Rice canceled trips, and the very first thing that he did, and that Secretary Clinton did, and all the way through, we deployed Marines in Darwin, here in Australia. We have stepped up our Marine patrols. We have gone to ASEAN and informed the Chinese that we were not going to take a stance in these disputes in the South and East China Sea, but we expected them to be resolved multilaterally. So I don't think you can say that's true in Asia. I think also in Ukraine, really what happened was Putin thought he had a puppet government. That puppet government fled. He thinks we were behind it. We weren't. And he then invaded Crimea and destabilized East Ukraine in return. And so I think, as I said, the Syria thing may have emboldened him some, but I don't think that's fair either.
Well, on Syria, your argument then is if President Obama had acted earlier, we may have averted the worst of the civil war. But the counter-argument, Anne-Marie, might be that if Washington and Britain took out Assad in 2012, would that have created a security vacuum for the very Sunni jihadists we're now fighting?
Yes, yeah. So let me be very clear, and I actually thought this was my position in Libya as well. We should never have taken out Assad. Right? That is not what I'm arguing. If we have learned...
So no to regime change.
Right, no regime change. If the United States has learned anything, it is that it is far easier to take out a government than to build a new one, and that if you are the one who caused the revolution, then you do have a tremendous responsibility. I mean, we have the state of Iraq since 2003 is on our shoulders, because as horrible as Saddam Hussein was, we knocked him out, we knocked out the army, we knocked out the bureaucracy, and we left anarchy in many ways. So my proposition was never to take out Assad. It was to force Assad to the negotiating table. You have to have a political solution. But the only way to do that was to stop him from winning by deeply illegal crimes against humanity. And that what you would do was either create the safe zone, or I would have simply bombed his Air Force on the tarmac and said, you can't use this to drop barrel bombs on people. My point is that you intervene to protect the people. You don't intervene to overturn the regime.
Libya, 2011, just after you left the State Department, Washington, London and Paris, led by Sarkozy, pushed for a no-fly zone in Libya. But if you look at Libya today, the prevailing wisdom is the downfall of Gaddafi has not just created a failed state, it's created, I think Rand Paul, one of the Republican presidential candidates, made this point, it's now a wonderland for jihadists.
Yeah, so this is the same, and I argued strenuously for intervention when the Libyan troops were approaching Benghazi, and talking about going door to door. I thought we were facing a massacre of enormous proportions, and did support intervention. Where we made the mistake was intervening for humanitarian reasons, because that's why we intervened. It was responsibility to protect, which means we were intervening to stop war crimes, crimes against humanity, possible genocide. NATO turned that into essentially a war to overturn Gaddafi. And I wrote an op-ed about 3 weeks in that said we should cut a deal with Gaddafi because we're flooding the zone with guns. And no matter what, you knew that putting that many guns into a country was going to be terrible afterwards. You weren't going to be able to stop it. So this is where I think the way we intervened in Libya and our failure afterwards to put in a multilateral force or to put in the kind of global effort we would have had to put in to help rebuild the country, that was a mistake. And if that was the only way we were going to do it, then we were wrong to intervene.
Now, Donald Trump distinguishes himself from not just Republicans but Democrats on the question of foreign policy. And he consistently argues that the record of US intervention in the Middle East post 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, all too often makes a bad situation worse. And he's argued that, yeah, sure, it might bring down these brutal authoritarian regimes like Saddam, but it involves a lot of loss and it's fraught with the danger of unintended consequences. And his argument is, and this is not a minority view in America, it's a very war-weary public, that the downfall of some of these regimes has created security vacuums for the very Sunni jihadists we're arguing. Does Trump have an argument here? And I think Bernie Sanders intriguingly agrees with it, that America's interventions in the Middle East all too often makes a bad situation worse.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm not sure. I don't think Hillary Clinton would disagree with that. I mean,
really? Even though she was the architect of the Libyan campaign?
You know, what she says about Libya also is the way it unfolded with then the, overturning the Gaddafi regime and not then having a stabilization force, disarmament, demobilization, sort of the full panoply of peace building. She would say, I've not heard her say, I would decide differently today, but she doesn't think this is a good situation. No, my argument, let me be clear. I think the argument that going in and overturning governments does make things worse is correct, right? I mean, I think if you'd gone into Afghanistan and you'd gone after Al-Qaeda, it was hard to go after Al-Qaeda without overturning the Taliban, right? And in that sense, that was self-defense. So that one is very difficult to call. Iraq, absolutely a terrible, terrible, tragic error. And Libya, I would say the right intention and the wrong execution. What I'm arguing for is, but the flip side is you do nothing, right? You do nothing. You let a government massacre its people. Then what happens is I think you would have ultimately seen radical alternatives on their own. And you're there standing up and saying that you stand for human rights and you stand for these people, but you will not do anything, even when it's within your power. And establishing a safe zone is very different than overturning a government. And we've established safe zones before, and we've maintained them. Or in Kosovo, where we did not overturn the Serbian government, we simply made clear that Milosevic had to stop ethnic cleansing. He destabilized the whole region. So it's that balance. It's standing up to crimes so great that they meet the standard of genocide or crimes against humanity without turning that into the political overturning of a government.
Anne-Marie, you mentioned the 21st century, a century of the Americas, right? Yep. 5 years ago, President Obama came to Australia. He addressed the Parliament in Canberra, late 2011, and he proclaimed his policy of the pivot, where he would redirect over time US strategic diplomatic influence away from the Middle East towards East Asia. And yet within 2 years, he missed a couple of key Asia-Pacific summits. There was a government shutdown in Washington. But there is a consensus emerging that the Obama administration has been so focused on the problems of the Middle East, particularly with the rise of the Islamic State jihadists, but also with the problems in Russia and Ukraine and Europe, that he has pivoted away from the pivot. And meanwhile, you've got Admiral Harry Harding, the head of the Pacific Command, I think only last week in congressional testimony, fretting about China asserting hegemony in the Asia-Pacific. Question here is, should we be worried about the extent of American influence in Asia in the post-Obama era?
So I think, again, it's very hard to be all places at once. and the escalation, this is again why I think Syria is such a black mark on the administration, because as it's expanded, remember, ISIL did not exist 2 years ago. It did not exist. Al-Nusra did not exist. You actually did have a free Syrian army for at least 18 months. And so the sort of the metastasizing of the Syrian conflict has forced him to go back. But I think, again, if Secretary Clinton wins, she'll be very focused on Asia. The problem in Asia is not that America's not here. It's that China's not willing to play by the rules. And at what, are you really willing to confront China? None of our Asian allies want us to do that, right? They want us to be there, but they don't want us to be there in too aggressive a form. But then what happens, So China keeps building these islands and starts overflying and bases their troops there. At some point, either you stand up to them and risk conflict, or you essentially acquiesce to the fact that there's one really big country in this region and a lot of much smaller countries. And so I don't think the issue is whether we're here. I think the question is how we're here, and are we willing to confront China when the rest of the region is saying, we don't want to.
Before we open it up to questions on foreign policy or domestic politics for that matter, I'll just ask one question about the presidential campaign, because it's on the mind of a lot of people who do follow America for understandable reasons. I think Thomas Jefferson once said, there are two favourite countries in the world for everyone, their own and France. Today, it's their own and America. Everyone is very much interested in American politics. The overwhelming prevailing wisdom, I think it's fair to say, is that because of this civil war that's taking place right now in the Republican Party, and we heard the former Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney come out speaking very critically of Donald Trump overnight. Because of this civil war, Hillary Clinton is probably going to be the favourite for the presidential election campaign. And if Trump is the nominee, divisive rhetoric, there's no real core philosophical governing agenda. He'll split the Republicans, he'll turn off a lot of independents and unite the Democrats. That's the prevailing wisdom. But just say for argument's sake, and you'll hear this from the Trump people, Trump has an amazing ability to win over people who don't usually vote. And in a country with voluntary voting, that's a pretty significant asset. And according to many public polling analysis surveys, 20% of his supporters are registered Democrats. So that's another huge advantage for Trump. How would the Clinton campaign deal with that? The fact that someone can win over people who don't vote and also appeal to a lot of blue-collar, working-class Democrats?
Well, I agree with you that he's appealing across party lines. There's no question. I mean, he is appealing to people who have lost out. And these are white working class men who feel like they've been on the wrong end of the stick for decades. And in many cases, that's right. Many of the economically, they've stagnant or flat. And male working class unemployment is much higher, and particularly in Midwest and places where traditional factory jobs have disappeared. And at the same time, it's very easy to mobilize that constituency against what looks like political correctness or identity politics. So that he can definitely do that. But here's why I'm optimistic. Because in the first place, Hillary Clinton has not thus far been able to mobilize all women. Right? It's been one of the striking things. Younger women are voting for Bernie Sanders. But I think if you put Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton side by side, and he debates in his lovely debating style. I can't wait to hear what he has to say about her face and body. I think you're going to have women rise up in a body. I really do. And lots of Republican women will vote for Hillary Clinton. And I also think, I do in the end have faith in our democracy. We are broken in many ways. We really are. But I think, unlike the 1930s, when you didn't have strong democracies and you had populist and indeed fascist parties, I think you will see a huge number of Americans say this cannot be. We cannot have a playground bully reality TV star who thinks that, talking about building a wall against others and insulting people in a way that just is horrifying, be the President of the United States. So I really do think you'll see a shift if that's what it comes down to.
And on that note, Robert Kagan, a very influential neoconservative intellectual, just wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post a week ago, making it clear that he, and presumably other neoconservatives, will be supporting Hillary.
Yes.
And that Donald Trump is the Frankenstein the Republican Party's created. Okay, questions? Yes, ma'am. Just wait for a microphone.
Thank you so much for your terrific speech.
Thank you.
Having served for or worked for Hillary Clinton before, assuming she wins, would you be tempted to work for the administration again?
Yes. But
Your children are all grown up now, aren't they?
No,
No?
believe me. I was on a TV show this morning, got a frantic text from my 17-year-old who's applying to college. So I've got another year, and I'm also very committed to New America. So I'm not saying that this is something I would do immediately, but there's no question. In the first place, I'd love to be in the administration of the first woman president of the United States. That's a historic thing. And second, I think she will be a very, very good president. I think she's a far better governor than she is a candidate. Just her nature, she's happier getting things done than selling herself. And I certainly would consider being a part of that.
Yes, sir. Oh, wait for the microphone. Just always wait for the microphone, please.
I had a question about your own intellectual evolution, in particular in the context of for our students here who are considering the bridge, sometimes the chasm between an academic life and a policy life. And you've been in both worlds. And I was wondering how much your own worldview, your own intellectual approach to international relations changed from the time you spent in government, and in particular when it had to do with issues that particularly put legal, because of your background in international law, principle up against what might be called, realism or the world of anarchic conditions you've described. And given the last time I heard you speak, it was about Iraq, where I think you said it was an illegitimate war, an illegal war, but a legitimate intervention. So I'm just wondering how you parse out the legal versus the realist perspectives, given your own experiences.
Yeah. So let me start by correcting you on Iraq. So what I said about Iraq the day after we invaded was it was illegal, was clearly illegal, but potentially legitimate. And what I said was, if we find weapons of mass destruction, if the Iraqi people welcome us with open arms, and if we return to the UN, those three factors, then it would have been legitimate. None of those obtained, and I think it was illegal and illegitimate, without any question. And frankly, I, for one, believed there were weapons of mass destruction, and I, like so many others, will not be so naive again. That's interesting. So, well, in one way, it confirmed, many people will say, well, I went to Washington and I realized that, academic theories did not obtain. And in one sense, the word academic in Washington means irrelevant. And you hear it 4 or 5 times a day, meaning irrelevant. So but on the other hand, I could frequently see in a room where we were talking about policy options, I could establish the intellectual pedigree. I could say, that's the democratic piece, and that's, Michael Doyle and others. That's, thinking international institutionalism, and that's Bob Cohan and lots of other people. So I actually saw the ways in which at least some of our work in international relations does shape policy, even though the practitioners of it don't realize that. What I came back with, though, was of this tremendous awareness of, as I said, the paucity of our tools, right? That we have just a very limited tool set. And those are still the tools that I think you can trace back to game theory and Tom Schelling in 1961, and the world is just much more complicated. And the other thing I came back with was an appreciation of development. Definitely when I went to the State Department, I was a believer in diplomacy and international institutions and military force where necessary. But Secretary Clinton taught me more than I taught her on the tremendous importance of thinking about development as foreign policy, not as this kind of other area that you do out of the goodness of your heart or whatever else, but because that's a key part of foreign policy.
Before we go to the next question, a follow-up question. Donald Trump, on the eve of the South Carolina presidential primaries, on the Iraq question, said that George W. Bush not only made a big effing mistake by invading Iraq, he lied about WMD, and everyone around him lied about WMD, and moreover, he did not make America safe because 9/11 happened on Bush's watch. Now, he wasn't talking to Michael Moore leftists, he was talking to conservative Republicans, and he won convincingly. How do you respond to that?
Well, this is why there is, depending who Trump's insulting, occasionally a stop clock is right once a day. I mean, occasionally you think, yeah, okay, that he's speaking truth and I agree with him, but it doesn't justify it. So the 9/11 thing's ridiculous. I mean, yes, okay, Bush should have paid more attention to stuff about Al-Qaeda, but the idea that he was going to stop that attack or that Trump would have, I think, is certainly not true. I don't think Colin Powell was not lying. No. I mean, and indeed, my Democrat friends had told me they thought he had weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. I mean, this was something that people in the end of the Clinton administration believed and the early Bush administration believed. So I don't think they were lying. I do think there were neocons in the George W. Bush administration who were determined to invade Iraq no matter what, right. And it wasn't about weapons of mass destruction, and that was a terrible and tragic error, more than that. But, overall, he's not right.
And let's not forget the Russian and French intelligence also believed he had WMD. Yes, question at the back there with Kath.
Obama's desire to reduce armed conflict as much as possible, and that this came in concert with an increased focus on domestic issues, so economic problems. I'm interested in your thoughts on how you would see a Clinton administration proceeding in the domestic sphere if underpinned by Clinton's perhaps more active approach to foreign conflict. How would those two priorities be balanced, do you think?
It's a very good question. So she was a domestic policy person long before she was Secretary of State, right? Her roots are in children's policy, women's policy. I first heard about Hillary Clinton in 1990 in a list of the 50 most influential lawyers in the United States, and Hillary Clinton was listed because of her work with the Children's Defense Fund. And I remember looking at it and going, oh, that's interesting. I never heard of Hillary Clinton, but there she was. And then you remember, she fought for health care. It was not a happy experience, but that's what she wanted to do. That's what she did as First Lady in Arkansas. So I do think she will be deeply focused on improving the lot of working families. I mean, that's where she sees where she can make the greatest contribution, that working families as a whole, men, women, children, have gotten the raw end of the deal, and we need to build what I think of as a new social contract. She would not describe it in such grand rhetorical terms, but that's what I think she will do. And I think it's more going to be like her husband, right? Bill Clinton was primarily a domestic policy president, but there were key areas where he had to act. Rwanda was awful, right? But then I think what he did in the Balkans and in Iraq initially with safe zones and maintaining them, he was willing to get out there as need be, but not sort of looking for dragons to slay. And I think that's probably at least how she'd want it to be. You know, obviously you can't ever predict the world, so.
Next question.
Sitting here and listening to this discussion about foreign affairs, it struck me that we were sitting here very much in a sort of macho environment where the entire discussion could have been transferred onto sort of the keyboards and the various other things of games of power and war and influence in a very limited masculinist view of what international politics are about. We now have women at the head of the World Bank, of various other things. We may well have a woman president in the United States. How do we actually get to a discussion about the sorts of social issues that are really important, that underpin a lot of the war issues, that inequalities, the problems we have with neoliberalism, the problems we have with market forces, the problems that we have which have been mainly driven by a particularly masculinist version of economics, that we can actually start talking about the sort of lives that people have and to talk about the areas which are really important to people, rather than sitting here in all our glory talking about blokes wanting to kill each other or wondering how not to do it.
Thank you for that. You know, I think that is what the focus on development is. No, it wasn't. I mean, what Secretary Clinton said when she, in her original testimony, she said, I'm going to stand for smart power. And smart power is based on diplomacy, defense, and development. And I'm going to make development an equal pillar. And that is exactly what she's talking about. She's talking about the lives of ordinary people, particularly women, because if you're looking at, you know, how you can make a difference in terms of education and strengthening families and reducing the size of families and community health and opportunity, pouring an enormous amount into women and girls. And she, you know, unlike Madeleine Albright, who was the first woman Secretary of State and so had to be sort of out-tough the men, Hillary Clinton was willing to stand up and say, I'm going to make women's rights one of the core parts of what I stand for. So I do think that's exactly what that's about. She would not describe it as feminist versus masculinist, but let me just say that in Washington, if I convene a meeting on national security, it will be 10 men for every 1 woman. And if I convene a meeting on international development, it will be 10 women or, for every 2 men. So yes. This is about bringing 2 different perspectives together and making them equal.
Yes, ma'am.
Linking to both questions from that side of the room, given the Libyan experience and what it meant for R2P, how, if at all, can we recover R2P and that attempt to get legitimacy and legality back to protection of civilian populations?
Well, so here, you know, I am an international lawyer originally, and international lawyers take the long view because we had the Declaration of Universal Human Rights was signed in 1949. The International Convention on Civil and Political Rights wasn't concluded till 1966. And there was no mention of human rights in U.S. foreign policy till 1976, and it was regarded as shocking when Jimmy Carter appointed someone to advance human rights in the State Department. So we have a long view. And by the long view, the responsibility to protect comes on the international scene in the early aughts and is approved at the Millennial Summit in 2005. We're barely a decade on, and it's been referenced a couple of times in Security Council resolutions and used in Libya. And yes, because it was used in Libya, states have pulled back. But the underlying logic that really starts in World War II, right? That had we acted when Hitler was massacring Jews and others, before he started invading other countries, things could have been different. That's the logic of R2P, that governments that will not just, mistreat their citizens, many governments, including my own, mistreat their citizens and violate human rights, but do that to the level of, remember, genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. The world must act then. That is our security. That logic is irrefutable, and I am confident we will move back to the responsibility to protect. We will need to make it clear that that does not mean overturning governments. We will need, as Brazil has advanced, a concept of responsibility while protecting. I think that's correct. And we will need to ask the question, will we do more harm than good by intervening for the very people we're trying to protect? But this will be the century where that doctrine will actually change our concept of sovereignty, so that you are sovereign, but you are not free to commit crimes against humanity or genocide or ethnic cleansing against your people.
Time for at least a couple more. Yes, ma'am?
To follow up on your point about the limitations of the tools and the tool shed. Can you flesh out more about what these tools are to deal with the network threats? Who's doing the thinking about it? And where do we go?
So I could have paid you to ask that question, because that's my next book. So I teed it up nicely, and this is actually the book I was going to write the summer that my article in The Atlantic came out, and I've spent the last 3 years working more on work and family issues than foreign policy. But I believe that the kinds of tools we need are how to create networks to make us more resilient, to counter bad networks, and the military has done that, right? That you can't beat a network unless you make a network, but not in any way that, say, if you wanted to deploy a network against traffickers in humans, or money laundering, or the many other scourges that are enabled by global networks. Networks of scale, right? So we have many NGOs that are doing great work in many countries, but we have no way of linking them so that you actually get a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. In a few places, yes. In the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization, yes, that is a global coalition. I would describe it as a very large network that works. So what I'm doing is using network theory, because there's a mass of theory about what networks should look like, what kinds of networks work for what kinds of purposes, and developing a very simple toolbox, the same way that Schelling took game theory and developed a very simple toolbox to use in more traditional geopolitics.
Yes, question over there.
I think in the US we're headed for a couple of very painful and messy months. I'd like to fast forward through all that.
Yeah.
So let's say we're a year and a half down the road, and it's the beginning of Hillary's first 2 terms. And I say that not because I'm a huge Hillary fan, but because the alternatives are unthinkable. One of my concerns is what she'll be able to get done. We all laugh about Obama derangement syndrome, but I remember what happened under Clinton and how committed his opponents were to keeping him from doing anything. That will happen again. What do you think she'll be able to get done?
Well, in the first place, I think a lot of that's going to depend on what the shakeout is from this civil war in the Republican Party, because you really have no idea. I think, if what this is a reassertion of rationality, or kind of basic common sense, then you will see, even with Republicans, you'll see them wanting to get things done. And I will say, in the United States, much was made of the fact that during the last near government shutdown, it was the 20 women in the Senate who brokered a deal, because they know each other, because they have dinner once a month, and they know each other across party lines. And Secretary Clinton was a big part of that group. So I can see a Congress that may be still majority Republican, but that looks very different, with a set of Republicans willing to cross party lines to strengthen their wing of the Republican Party. Even if, and you're actually seeing some of this now. Paul Ryan is willing to cut deals much more than his predecessor was, or is able to. I also do think, though, she has much more experience working in Congress than Barack Obama did, and working with Congress. I mean, she was in the Senate longer. She was more active, and then again, she was in the White House in the 90s, where you're right, Newt Gingrich was terrible, but by 1996, 96 through 2000, Bill Clinton was able to get quite a lot of legislation through. So, is it going to be, she doesn't believe she's going to magically change Washington politics, but she believes that she'll be able to get some legislation through. We'll see.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Last question. Yep.
Thank you. The foreign policy question that Australians seem to be most concerned about is the future shape of relations between the US and China. And I recall from when you were last here in 2008 that you yourself have spent a considerable amount of time in China.
Did.
Right now, the news stories we read concerning China are rather worrying. We read about the expansion in the South China Sea, and we read about what seems to be an increasing oppression of dissent and establishment of a personality cult in China itself. And I wonder if you could speculate a bit on the future course of US-China relations.
Yes. So I think, again, I'm going to leave the wild card out of this. I'm going to assume that we have either Secretary Clinton or a Republican establishment candidate, even if that does not seem likely. In fact, our China policy has been remarkably consistent since the opening to China. In other words, the U.S. has had the position, Republicans and Democrats, and I just heard a leading Republican senator say this at Munich, that the rise of China is good for the world, good for the United States, that we want a strong, stable China that is playing by international rules, but carrying its responsibilities in the global system and working with China on anti-terrorism, on climate change enormously, on trade. And that has been our policy, to confront on the issues where we have to confront, but to cooperate on the issues where China is essential to making things happen. And if I have to predict, I'd say that will continue. And the one great question, as I said, at what point, if ever, will the United States and other allies in Asia really decide to confront China on things like the South China Sea? And if and when that happens, that will be a game of chicken. That will be a, who blinks, and you'll have to find a face-saving way out. But that will be the great question. The much more worrying scenario is that China is in for a far more turbulent period than it has had. And the government is very worried. Its cracking down is not just out of a kind of neo-Maoist ideology. The cracking down is the fear that dissent could actually ignite. And I'm not saying I endorse it. I'm saying that's the way I read it. And that my friends in China say that, the talk of revolution, of real upheaval, is more common than they've ever seen it. And it's not surprising. There's a rising middle class. This is a very tricky period for any government. And when we saw that in the West, we saw lots of changes. If China were really to have, a revolutionary movement or a civil war or any kind of implosion, that's a very scary thing to try to manage. And a China that's afraid of that is often a China that will whip up nationalist sentiment and do things in foreign policy that we have to stand up to. And that, I think, is it's certainly not an unimaginable scenario. It may not be probable, but it's one we should be preparing for.
And on that note, one of America's leading sinologists, Professor David Shambar from George Washington University, I think about a year ago, wrote an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, got a lot of attention, called The Coming Chinese Crack-Up.
Yeah, no.
Fascinating. Anne-Marie, I wish we could go on. Thank you
It's been
so
great.
much.
Thank you all.
Lovely. Great. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce our Chairman of the Board at the US Studies Centre, Mark Bailey.
Thank you, Tom. And wow, I was just reflecting that we've gone from the universal, the global strategic issues, China, Middle East, down to the subatomic, the family relationships. So I think we've covered the theory of everything today. But it's been done in a way I think that everyone would appreciate, with a level of intellectual rigour and communication that, I give credit to Anne-Marie that it's highly unusual to attract an audience of this size on a sunny Friday afternoon in Sydney. So, but I would just like to thank you for your time, and we really appreciate it. I think certainly the audience did, judging by the number of questions that are still to be asked and answered. I'd also like to thank our inimitable speaker, Tom, from the Centre, and also the Sydney Opera House, who are our co-hosts of this event, who have brought Anne-Marie to Australia. We thank them very much for their help and support, and we look forward to working with them later on in the year. This is the Study Centre 10th anniversary. This is our first 10th anniversary event. We commenced in 2006, actually in the aftermath of the Iraq War, so it's interesting the circle that we are travelling. I would encourage people who are interested in continuing to have a connection with the Centre to subscribe to our newsletter. You'll get advised of events such as this in the future, and all the communication that we put out to our stakeholders. So please subscribe. Anne-Marie's new book, I think we probably talked about earlier on, Unfinished Business, Women, Men, Work and Family, will be available at the rear of the hall for $30 at the end of this. And Dr. Slaughter is going to be available for 10 minutes, I'm told, to sign some copies. So line up quickly if you'd like a signed copy. Once again, thank you for coming along, and please join me in a thanking.